Hey, it's Kristen from the Monroe County Library System. I have some books that I'd like to share with you today. All of them can be found on a variety of formats that we carry for the Monroe County Library System. So some of these titles you can find within our buildings, available in print, or you can access these through our different platforms such as Libby or Hoopla as an audiobook or ebook. The first book that I'm going to talk to you guys about today is a book by Jacob Riis. You might be familiar with this book or familiar with any of the photographs from this book. The title is How the Other Half Lives. And this was a pretty life-changing book for the time. It was written in 1890, and it really helped shed some light on the horrible conditions in which people were living in New York and New York City. The spotlight and the main focus of this is the different tenements that were in place in New York City, the close proximity that people had to live in, the condition of the places that people had to live in. You had multiple families that were living in tiny, tiny apartments. Landlords were taking advantage of the people and charging them obscene amounts. There was a lot of crime and disease in those areas. There was a lot of child labor that was happening also. And so what Riis wanted to do was document all of this through photography. He was a photojournalist. And so he would go around town and take photos of people while they were inside the apartments, inside bars, institutions, things like that. And then he would talk about his findings and eventually publish this book. It's a really fascinating book. It's not a very long read. It contains pictures, text, and also diagrams. So within this, he tells a pretty intense story of the things that people have to go through. And he also lays out a plan on how to improve on the conditions and the way that things are set up right now. Because of the time period in which the book is written, there are some expressions or names that would be inappropriate today. So he uses some stereotypes, ethnic and cultural stereotypes that are not appropriate. So just as a heads up on that front, but the overall idea was to spread the word and help change what was happening in these large populated cities. And what people were finding is after this book was published, it could be applied to a lot of other large cities during that time period when there wasn't a lot of housing rules on how housing should be or safety or cleanliness, things like that. So it kind of set up a platform to where those standards could be developed. And so it was a pretty renowned book. It's still pretty popular today. You may have already seen images of this book through textbooks as you were a kid. I remember specifically seeing a couple of Jacob Riis photographs in my history book, and they are widely available on Google. So you are welcome to look those up while you're reading the book. The copy that I looked at, there was only illustrations and not the actual photographs. So I think it depends on what kind of copy that you get. I'm going to share my screen with you real quick so you can see what the title looks like, or the book cover, I should say. So this is the book cover that I found. And you can see that this is a special illustrated edition, and it includes the photographs in it. So an interesting read, How the Other Half Lives. I know for a fact that we have this. I think I read it on Hoopla as an ebook. But if not, it is available on audiobook through other platforms. So that would be our first historical title. Not a super happy pick-me-up one, but definitely a good one. From there, we're going to go into another selection, and this is a relatively new book, but it's still, it's going to be from the early 1900s. This one is going to be Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women, and this book is by Kate Moore. This book focuses on a group of women who were employed to paint radium on clock faces, or like watch faces. So during this time period, radium was really popular. We didn't actually know that much about it, but because it was so new and it made things glow, it seemed very glamorous, and people really gravitated towards it. So people would paint their teeth with it. You can find advertisements where people are encouraging you to drink it, and that it will add years onto your life. And so unfortunately, it did not do that for these women. Over time, they realized that this radium is having a horrible effect on their bodies, and it is slowly deteriorating them. And so they are essentially the whistleblowers on this whole operation and are fighting for their rights. And so it has a lot to do with work activism, work labor, unions, human rights, and just really depicts what these women went through. And so it's a really fascinating story. It is super grim, but just the whole concept of the fact that like they were ingesting this radium, they were licking their paintbrush in between painting, which is how they got it in their body. But just the craziness behind radium and how everybody thought that it was this wonderful thing when in fact it was killing them is just, this crazy concept for this book. So another historical fiction that I highly recommend. One that kind of piggybacks off of this that we actually don't have in our library system, but is available in Melcat is another book. Oh, I should show you Radium Girls cover page. That way you can see it. I have to keep up on these cover pages. So this is the Radium Girls cover page. We have copies of this both in the building and through e-resources. The next book I'm going to talk to you about is this one right here, and it's called Bitten by Witch Fever, and it's put together by Lucinda Hawksley. And this one is Wallpaper and Arsenic in Victorian Homes. And so very similar to the radium craze that was happening in the early 1900s. In the late 1800s, there was this craze with wallpaper and wanting to have colorful wallpaper. Having bright colors during that time period was really a status symbol. And so they would use arsenic in their wallpapers, and it would create this really vibrant green that was beautiful, but it was essentially killing people. If the wallpaper got moist at all, if it was humid in the house, there was any kind of wet on that wallpaper, the vapors and the fumes of the arsenic would be released and the people would inhale it. So this book is really fascinating. It's not completely, it's kind of like How the Other Half Lives. It has pictures of the actual wallpaper samples, which is pretty amazing, and they are beautiful. But it also has some text with it, and in the text it talks about the history of wallpaper, the history of arsenic, and also this prominent figure, William Morris, and the role that he had to play in the arsenic in the wallpaper. So again, another crazy story where you kind of have to stop and think like, what, arsenic in your wallpaper? You want that in your house? But it was a different time period then, and it was seen as something, if you had that kind of wallpaper, then you were something, you were important in society. So that's definitely a book I would suggest checking out. The last one that I'd like to talk to you about, excuse me, is The Trial of Lizzie Borden. And I'm going to share my screen with you again. That way you can see the title of this one. And this one we have copies of in the building, and we also have e-resources on this one. This was a really fascinating read because it's taken from a nonfiction approach. The author, Kara Robertson, she looked at lots of different research in order to put this book together. So she based her text on transcripts from the court documents and the trial, newspaper articles, journals from the lawyers and people that were involved in the cases, and also letters that were written by Lizzie Borden herself. And so there's a lot of really interesting areas and avenues in which she gathered this information. And, Lizzie Borden, if by chance you're not familiar with that case, her parents were found stabbed in their home, and Lizzie was the only one who was home at that time. And so she became a suspect and was put on trial. Although she was acquitted, and nobody really knows who committed that crime. It's always kind of been one of those crazy, mysterious cases that people like to read about. And I really enjoyed this book because it presented both sides of anybody who was of suspicion and who could have been a suspect. So it was just a really fascinating read from a really dark time in history. So those are my 4 historical nonfiction picks. There will be more in the future. So thanks for sticking with me and checking it out. If you have any questions or would like to get any copies of these books, feel free to call up to your local library branch and we can help you put these on request, or you can check our online catalog. Thanks.